Even though there's a lot of passages in the Bible which I love, clearly my favorite passage in the entire gospel comes from the Gospel of Matthew. Gospel of Matthew chapter 11. Come to me, all you who are weary and find life burdensome, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm meek and humble of heart. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And I think the reason why I love that particular passage is because it's immensely practical. It gives us really specific and concrete advice as to how to process really difficult and stressful situations. So right off the bat, the Lord invites us to come to Him whenever we are feeling weary, whenever we are feeling heavy laden, to not be shy, to not be reluctant, to not be embarrassed, to not go the way of distraction or avoidance or all those traditional things we tend to do to cope in the midst of the world, but instead to come to Him early and often, whenever we're feeling even the slightest impingement upon our hearts. To not simply ask Him for the grace to get through an especially difficult situation, but to ask Him for insight, for truth, for enlightenment, to see things clearly. Lord, am I looking at the situation clearly? Is there something I need to do to change my perspective or to approach the problem in a particular sort of way? And you see, in this, we're meant to find this recurring dynamic that we often find in the context of spiritual life, this interplay between gift and task. And so the whole idea is that whenever we receive a particular grace in the context of this world, certainly it's always a gift, freely given, freely received, never earned. But at the same time, often it's linked with a particular task. There's something we need to do to unlock the lock or to unwrap the gift. And in the context of this particular passage from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 11, the whole idea is that an important prerequisite to receiving the gift of God's grace, His peace, is that we need to receive His yoke and to imitate His meekness and His humility. And so again, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm meek and humble of heart. And so given all that, perhaps we might kind of deal with these things one at a time. And so first of all, this notion of the yoke. And so a yoke basically involves two parts. And so first of all, there's a harness which goes around the neck of the animal. And then there's this bar called the halter, which is at the rear of an animal. And a yoke, more to the point, is typically borne by two or more animals. And so let's say, for example, just to keep it simple, there's two animals. Typically, there would be a pairing between an experienced animal and a less experienced animal. And then in effect, if you're the less experienced animal, is that you need to learn to take the lead of the experienced animal, to learn to go at the pace of the experienced animal, not too fast, not too slow. Because if you go too fast, you start to choke on the harness. If you go too slow, you start to feel the bar hitting on the back of your legs. And that's not comfortable either. And so the whole idea is that unless you learn to, again, follow the lead of the experienced animal, you will never experience the yoke being easy or the burden being light. But that takes us to the notion of meekness, right? And so in the context of the lectionary, you'll often hear this word translated as gentleness, which, to be honest, is kind of misleading. And so meekness doesn't mean gentleness, it doesn't mean being shy, it has nothing to do with social dexterity, but instead it's all about focus and discipline. And so to use an example, think about St. Peter or St. Paul or even St. Augustine. All these guys, pre-conversion, full of strength, full of power, but all over the place. And so think, for example, of St. Peter cutting off that servant's ear in the garden in the context of Holy Thursday. Think about St. Paul roaming the countryside, persecuting and killing Christians. Or think about St. Augustine, who was perpetually trapped in the sin of fornication. But you see, put a pause on that, and now think about all three figures post-conversion. And so once these three guys converted to Christ, they had all their strength, all their power, all their vigor. But now they were useful. They could live with focus, discipline, purpose, and mission. We're called to recognize that meekness is not weakness, but instead it's strength with focus, power with discipline. In any case, that brings us to the notion of humility. And again, not unlike meekness, humility is often misunderstood. And so I think a lot of times people think about humility in terms of being dishonest. And so I deny the fact that God has given me various graces and blessings, gifts and talents. But humility is not about being dishonest. It's all about being fully present to one's life, instead of simply living in one's head, where we're all kind of prone to egotism, fear, and pride. And so the example that always comes to mind to illustrate this particular point, imagine you're a professional basketball player in the context of the NBA. And so let's say, for example, you're playing in the midst of a playoff game. What are you thinking as you run down the court? You're probably not thinking, look, I hope I don't miss this shot. But here's the other thing. You're probably not thinking as well, I'm totally going to make this shot because I'm awesome. Instead, you're not thinking at all. You're simply lost in the great rhythm and beauty of the game. And so it goes with humility. You're not living in your head, but instead you're fully present to life, giving yourself permission to get lost again in the great rhythm and beauty of your actual life. Okay, now obviously there's kind of a lot going on here, but perhaps I'm going to suggest that a more practical way to remember all these points we're making today is to think of it in terms of a checklist or a series of questions. And so, for example, do I have this habit of prayer where I constantly turn to the Lord, certainly to examine and review my conduct, but also to take captive my own thoughts, to constantly ask myself the question with the Lord, is this particular thought or this particular thought pattern from the Lord or not? And in the aftermath of making that decision, to firmly choose to accept or reject that particular thought or thought pattern. Another question you might ask yourself, am I focusing on the few things the Lord wants me to do carefully and well? Focusing simply on the things that He's calling me to do as opposed to the multitude of things that I could do or I should do. And the third thing to kind of ask yourself, do I have good process? Am I going too fast? Am I going too slow? Am I living in my head where we're all prone to give into fear and pride and egotism? Or am I giving myself the freedom and the permission to simply live my life, to abide in the present moment, to love God in the present moment, to allow myself to get lost in the great rhythm and beauty of my actual life? Okay, one final example, and I'll kind of end with this. And this involves Dr. Bob Schutz, who of course is one of the co-hosts for the Restore to Glory podcast. And so basically the way Dr. Bob tells the story, he was having an argument with his late wife Margie, in the aftermath of which he felt kind of bitter and defensive. But fortunately, he took the thing to prayer. And basically in the context of prayer, the Lord revealed to Dr. Bob this really important insight. And so basically, just to kind of paraphrase, what the Lord said to Dr. Bob was like, look, don't be resentful of your wife. Your wife is not rejecting you, but instead she's pointing out certain behaviors, certain things that you're doing, which are preventing you from becoming your true self. Things which actually constitute barriers to you actually receiving my grace. And once Dr. Bob received this particular perspective, it changed everything. And so he was able to re-engage into this conversation with his wife, his relationship with his wife with a certain freedom, a certain joy, a certain gratitude, even a certain excitement. Because now he was seeing his wife as a gift given to him by the Lord to lead him to new freedom, to help him become the person that God was calling him to be, and the person that he himself ultimately wanted to be. Now, depending on how you look at it, this particular example is relatively simple and straightforward, but at the same time, I want to be clear in terms of why I'm bringing this up. And so for my money, this particular example is really striking in the sense that it really speaks to the fact that oftentimes the very idea of bringing our difficult situations to the Lord in prayer can be scary. And so a lot of times in places we don't like to talk about at parties, I think a lot of times we are a little bit afraid that the Lord will tell us some variation of like, look, just suck it up. Whereas in reality, if we actually come to Him with a spirit of openness to the truth, openness to change, openness to conversion, we will realize in retrospect that the Lord truly is the Good Shepherd. He is the one who truly leads us to green pastures. He is the one who alone has the yoke which is easy and the burden which is light.